Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today I'm looking at the Chord Hugo TT2, and this is kind of a second part in a series that began with looking at the Qutest and the Chord M scaler combined, and considered whether or not that combination was potentially better than the TT2. So if that's of interest to you, you may want to go back and check that video out, but realistically these videos are probably interchangeable in terms of the order that you watch them. The Hugo TT2 is a $5,500 US DAC and headphone amp, and even power amplifier if you want to look at it that way, or in Australian dollars, that equates to about 8,500 Australian dollars. So it's a really significant investment, and therefore my big question for today's review is it really worth the money? So stay tuned and stick with me while we work out the answer to that question. The TT2 here is a DAC, headphone amplifier, power amplifier, and preamplifier, all built into a single unit. I'm traditionally not a huge fan of all-in-ones, but I was intrigued by the TT2 because of the level of performance it's intended to provide at each of those functions. This is one of those occasions where it's not a case of cutting corners in order to produce an all-in-one, so much as a product where the intention was to minimize the number of connections and therefore the potential degradation of the signal from the time it leaves the DAC to the time it reaches your headphones or your speakers. Now for those looking for a review of the TT2 with speakers, unfortunately I'm not a passive speaker user and therefore I can't provide that information, so I apologize about that. What I will include in this review though is a discussion of everything that the TT2 does, from its DAC, its filtering, its crossfeed, its amplification prowess, all the way through. The only thing I'm not going to cover is amplification of passive speakers. Let's start now with the design of the unit. The TT2 is a gigantic block of aluminium, very similar to the M scaler that I recently discussed with the Chord Qutest. The TT2 is quite large. It's a bit smaller in terms of footprint than an LP. It's made out of two blocks of aluminium. There's a small seam around the sides here where it joins together, and everything you need is housed in this one block. It weighs a fair bit as you'd expect, and therefore has a really high quality feel. While I'm handling the unit here, one of the things I really like about it is the rubber feet are very soft and squidgy. And what that means is that when you put the TT2 on a surface, it's going to be fairly well isolated from vibrations coming through from that surface. Some rubber feet can be a bit firm and translate vibrations from a desk into devices, and that can actually create very low levels of distortion and noise in an electronic circuit. So it's nice to see that the TT2 is well isolated. I'm guessing there's probably even better feet out there on the market if you're really looking to isolate it from vibrations, but it's a nice start that these are part of the included package. Just quickly looking at the TT2 as it sits on the desk, on the top here is a viewing window, and you can see through the viewing window into the FPGA chip, which is the heart and soul of the TT2 DAC, and indeed any of Chord's DACs. The viewing window lights up different colors depending on the sample rate that's coming through at the time. And while at first many people find the color scheme feedback system that Chord use to be a little bit confusing, when you think about it as a simple rainbow scale, it becomes quite straightforward. And what I mean by a rainbow scale is it's the standard sequence of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, or ROGBIV if you want to remember it. That's the way it communicates which sample rate it's using. So red being your lowest sample rate, your 44.1, all the way through to the violet color, which is your top end sample rates, such as DSD, or if you've got an upsampled signal coming through from the M scaler, it's going to be a violet viewing window. That same chromatic scale also works for the volume knob here. So as you start with the lowest possible volume, it's red. Now I should mention, if the volume is muted, the ball is actually black like it is now when it's depowered. When you start turning the volume up, the moment it starts to produce output, it goes red, and again that will move all the way through to a violet color at maximum volume. I'd be amazed if anyone ever gets to maximum volume on this for normal listening, because there's huge amounts of power coming from it. But potentially for passive speakers, depending on how sensitive they are, you might use the upper levels of the volume output from the TT2. I personally am a fan of the chromatic scales for both the sample rate and the volume. I enjoy the colorfulness of it. It adds a bit of interest to my desk here. It's not all just simple blacks and silvers and very basic looking devices. I like the bit of color, so I enjoy that, but I do understand that some people don't like it so much. Continuing the tour of the TT2 here, on the top you've got a black panel. This is where the Bluetooth receiver sits. So the Hugo TT2 is capable of taking a Bluetooth signal input. At the front here where we've got another black window, this is for the LCD display. So this comes on only when necessary to show you things like the volume level, whether it's in amp mode or DAC mode or headphone mode, and I'll talk about those shortly. It shows you the crossfeed settings you're using, the filter settings you're using, pretty much any information that you need other than volume and sample rate is going to come through the LCD display here. While we're looking at the LCD display, I want to point out one little criticism I have, and that is the angle of it. So because you've got an LCD display that's visible through this front panel here and also through the top panel, depending on the height of your desk and exactly where the TT2 is sitting, the display can easily get cut down the middle by this beveled edge as it rolls over to the front. And in my case, that's exactly what happens. So if I want to see what the LCD display says, I've got to sit up or lean down a little bit in my chair to see the LCD display through either the front or the top. I can't see it at a glance because it's obscured by this central bar. Now, I'm not sure exactly how that could have been fixed. Perhaps it could have been a single angled piece of perspex over the top. It's a minor thing, it's not a big deal because you're very rarely having to look at that display, but it is a slight drawback for me, particularly at this sort of price level where a lot of people are rightfully going to expect that everything's done just right. One final point about the LCD display is that I mentioned before it turns itself off, or it only turns on when it has something to show you, and that's to minimize any potential noise coming from the circuitry of the LCD display. And that's something that a lot of high-end products do. You may remember if you watched the Sparkos Labs Aries amplifier review that also has functionalities that switch themselves off when not in use to maximize the audio quality. So it's a nice touch that at this level of high-end performance, you really want every last bit of detail taken into account to maximize the performance that you're getting out of the equipment. So Chord have done that by having this LCD display switch off when not in use. And as I said before, you don't really need to look at it that often, so I've found that having that display on all the time is really not something that I missed. Looking along the front of the unit now, we've got the buttons along the front here which are for the menu, the set button and the power. So power is straightforward, it's simply on or off. The menu button cycles through your options, things like crossfeed, the filter that you're using, whether the unit's in DAC mode or amp mode, and the set button is used to then cycle through them. There's no enter button or anything like that. Basically, once you choose the option you want with the set button, you pause for a moment and the unit will stay in whatever setting you've left it on. So it's a nice simple interface and it's very easy to use. Jumping over here to the other side, we've got 3 headphone outputs. Now, many people are going to bemoan the fact that there's no balanced output from the TT2, and I have to agree, but not from a sound quality point of view, purely from a convenience point of view. Most of my high quality headphones are terminated with 4-pin XLRs, and so it's a bit of a disappointment that I can't plug it directly in here, and instead I have to use an adapter to connect either to the front here, or you can get adapters wired up to run out of the balanced outputs on the back. From a sound quality point of view, it makes no difference at all. There is so much power available and the signal is so clean that you shouldn't worry about needing a balanced drive to get the most out of your headphones. But it's not as convenient as I'd like it to be when you do have balanced terminations for your other amplifiers and you can't plug them directly into the TT2. Instead, what I have to do is use a fly lead like this, plugged into the front, and then have the XLR connection in there. So it's not ideal. It's an extra connection in the signal chain, and it's just a bit of a hassle to have to constantly be using these sorts of adapters in order to connect to a high-end piece of equipment like this. All that said, I want to give props to Chord for providing multiple headphone outputs. For many headphone enthusiasts, we are going to have more than one headphone, and sometimes it's nice to switch between the different headphones. So having multiple inputs is fantastic. One small challenge it creates is that you may need to unplug one headphone. Let's say you're using a higher impedance headphone that requires a higher volume level, and you also want to be using a lower impedance, more sensitive headphone. You may find that you need to disconnect one of them when using the other because the volume levels required for, say, the high impedance headphone are going to create too much output for your lower impedance or more sensitive headphone. So even though there are multiple outputs, I've found in my use case that I'm often actually disconnecting and reconnecting different headphones. So it's not a perfect solution, but it's certainly a good solution, and I like having the flexibility. 2 final points on the 3.5mm headphone output are that the recessed nature of the port makes the use of any right-angled connectors really, really challenging. So when you have this sitting on a desk or you have it sitting on, say, the M scaler even, the way that the port is recessed and shaped means that your right angled cable is coming straight out and pointing straight down. You can't turn it in any other direction. What that then means is that to then remove it, you've got to get right inside to try to pull out the plug or pull it by the cable, which is really not a good experience. So I don't know why they did that. It would have been so much better if they'd brought that forward a bit more flush with the unit and maybe just had it countersunk slightly like the 6.3 mils, but not as deeply to allow for those right angled cables. So I think this is a real design flaw, and I actually find whenever I'm using 3.5 mil plugs, I use a 6.3 mil to 3.5 mil adapter and just plug it into one of the large sockets. Another reason for that is the feeling of the 3.5 mil socket on my unit is really grabby and nasty. So pushing the plugs in is fine, but pulling it out, it almost feels like the contact inside the socket are grabbing and catching, and it feels like it's going to do damage. So I really don't like the feel of it. I should point out, I've bought this unit as an ex-demo unit, so it's possible that it has been slightly damaged. This may not be true for every single unit out there. So if you are a TT2 owner, I'd love to hear down in the comments how the 3.5 mil socket feels for you when you're removing plugs. Does it feel a bit sticky and grabby, or is it smooth like the 6.3 mil? That might just be that my unit's got the problem here, so I'd love to hear from you if you've had different experiences. Now, having covered everything on the front, let's turn it around and take a look at the back, because there's plenty going on there as well. On the back here, we've got these DX outputs, which I believe are one of these future use things that Chord have coming down the pipeline. So I don't know exactly what the DX outputs are for at this stage. We've then got RCA outputs left and right, straddled on either side of XLR outputs left and right. So this is a fully balanced design, as you'd expect for this level of device. Then at the far end here, we've got two BNC sockets. Finally on the back here, we've got two optical inputs and then a USB input as well. So this device will take pretty much any input you can think of, and it will take more than one version of a few of them. So you can run multiple coaxials, you can run multiple optical cables, only one USB cable. So plenty of options available, plenty of inputs, plenty of flexibility. The final thing I didn't mention is that right over on the side here is a 15 volt DC input. So the TT2, like most similar products on the market these days, does use a switch mode power supply, but according to Chord, it's a high quality switch mode power supply. And before we get into the conversation around it, it's not something I've played with trying different power supplies. I generally stick to the standard power supplies, unless it's a product like, say, the Topping D50S that drives off USB power, which is inherently noisy. I normally don't bother about playing with external power supplies. So having looked at all the inputs, outputs, the buttons, all of the design features of the TT2, my conclusion in that regard is that it's a beautifully made unit. It uses high quality connections all round. It has good interface in general, except for that little LCD issue I spoke about. So from a design point of view, it looks and feels the part of a $5,500 unit. The next step in the equation then for me when I think about reviewing these products is, what are the features and compatibility like? Does it work the way I expect it to? Is it easy to use? Does it do what I want it to do? So let's talk now a bit about the features and functions. I'm going to start talking about the remote control. I'm not normally someone that uses remote controls because my whole setup here is within reach from my sitting position at my desk. But if you are someone that's sitting back from the unit, particularly if you were using this as, say, a preamp, the remote control could come in really handy. And that's where a little bit of disappointment sneaks in. For the $5,500 price tag, what you get is a really basic and pretty cheap feeling remote control. It's not dissimilar feeling, and in some ways it feels worse than the Topping standard remote controls that come with all of their products, including budget units that are just over $100. So this is a bit of a disappointment that Chord haven't provided a better quality remote control. Obviously we don't want prices inflated by exotic materials being used in remote controls. But at the same time, when you've got such a beautiful piece of design and engineering in the TT2, to get a cheap plasticky remote does feel like a bit of a letdown. That said, the remote does everything it needs to do. The buttons are clearly laid out. They feel good and clear to press. They give you a good tactile feedback, and it does make using the device easier if you are sitting away from it. It's nice to have quick access to things like the filters and the crossfeed functions without having to go through the menu system, but it just would have been nice to have it feel and look a little bit more special when you're spending this much money on a piece of equipment. The next feature or features that I want to talk about is the various output modes of the TT2. The TT2 can work as a headphone amplifier, a preamplifier, an amplifier, and just as a standalone DAC. So it's incredibly versatile in that way. And I want to briefly step through how each of those modes work. Let's start by talking about DAC mode. In DAC mode, the TT2 has no volume control, so this front control ball will be dark like it is now, and the outputs at the back are fixed to 2.5 volts out. If, however, you want the outputs to be variable or you want to drive speakers directly off the outputs, you can change it into amp mode. So amp mode is designed to work exactly the same as DAC mode, but instead of putting out 2.5 volts here, you now have variable outputs here controlled using the control ball at the front. And that means you can have complete control over the output voltage all the way up to 3.3 volts, but also all the way down to muting them entirely. That's fantastic if you're using this to drive a power amplifier, if you're using it to drive active speakers, or indeed if you want to connect speakers directly to the TT2. As I already mentioned, I don't use passive speakers, so I can't comment on how well it drives speakers, but I do believe it's possible based on all the information put out by Chord. The final mode to talk about is headphone mode. Headphone mode is activated anytime you plug anything into one of these three outputs on the front, and it will immediately mute the rear outputs, as well as provide volume control if it wasn't already switched on. One thing worth noting here is that there's a 15-second delay anytime you switch modes in the TT2. For most people, that's not going to be a huge issue, but I found it really challenging because I tend to switch between different products a lot for testing. That 15-second delay made it really hard to do any kind of A/B comparisons. The reason for that 15-second delay, as far as I can tell, is that the TT2 uses supercapacitors, and so in order to change outputs, what I imagine is happening inside is that the capacitors have to be discharged, the relays then change the outputs, and the capacitors then have to be recharged, ready for the output to recommence. The reason that's important is if you switch outputs while those capacitors are fully charged, you could very quickly get a DC spike through the output, and you could damage your headphones, your amplifiers, whatever you're connected up to. So if I'm correct in the reasoning for it, I understand why it's being done. It's just a bit of a shame because 15 seconds is quite a long time. If you're halfway through a great track, it's a long pause while you wait for that sound to come through. So again, I understand why it's there. It is a bit of a niggle for me. It does get a bit frustrating from time to time, but it's not a deal breaker. It's just something I wanted to point out for those of you that do like to chop and change between devices. One final point on headphone mode is that the TT2 will very comfortably drive headphones on all three ports simultaneously. However, as I mentioned before, the volume levels required for different headphones may vary, and that can cause some problems if you've got a high sensitivity and a low sensitivity headphone running at the same time. You need to be careful to not have too much volume going to those high sensitivity headphones. Okay, so we've got two more features and functions to go. The first one I want to mention is the filters. The filters are pretty straightforward on the Hugo TT2 and exactly the same as those on the Qutest. So if you're familiar with the Qutest, you're familiar with the TT2's filters already. There are 4 filters available, and basically they're numbered 1 through 4, with number 1 being the standard reference filter. That's the one that's most true to source according to Chord. When you move to number 2, there's some high frequency filtering applied to the top of that. When you move to number 3, there's a deliberate bit of warmth added just to smooth off the sound for those that prefer that sort of signature. And then number 4 adds a little bit of high frequency filtering to that warmer sound signature from number 3. So they're quite simple filters. They're not drastically changing the tone of the DAC at all, but it is something that allows you a little bit of control if you prefer a slightly warmer sound. The feature that was more exciting for me to play with was Crossfeed. And that's really surprising because I normally don't like Crossfeed. For those not familiar with Crossfeed functions, what they're designed to do is recreate in headphone listening the sort of sound you get from speakers. Now the theory is that with speakers, your left ear is able to hear what the right speaker's doing, and your right ear obviously can hear what the left speaker's doing. And so Crossfeed is designed to bring certain frequencies from the left channel to the right and from the right to the left. The result should be a soundstage that is pushed back a little bit and more spacious, as if you're listening to speakers. Normally what I find with crossfeed circuits is that they mess with the tonality of the signal a little bit, and I find it less natural, and often there's a loss of some detail and clarity in the signal as a result, at least in terms of perception. Maybe the sounds are still there, but they're being masked now by whatever's happening with the crossfeed. In the case of the TT2, this is the first time I've ever preferred the sound using a crossfeed filter. So I don't know what they're doing differently to other systems on the market, but having played with the crossfeed in other products, in things like Roon software that gives you a couple of options as well, I've never found a crossfeed that I've enjoyed until now. The TT2 offers 3 levels of crossfeed, and of course crossfeed can be switched off altogether, so a total of 4 options. And at each step it just gets a little bit stronger in terms of the crossfeed. Not only do I like the crossfeed on the TT2, I actually like the maximum level of crossfeed because it really pushes the soundstage from being kind of like this to being more out there where it's more three-dimensional and out in front of you rather than wrapping around your head from your ears and out. So the crossfeed on this is actually excellent. I thoroughly enjoy it, and based on my past experiences, it really shocked me that I'm using it at all. Now, one final teeny tiny piece before we start talking sound quality is that the TT2 does require a driver to work with Windows. It doesn't require a driver to work with Mac, but the process for installing the driver on Windows is absolutely seamless. So compatibility wise, there's really no concerns running the TT2 with Windows, and obviously it's seamless with Mac. One thing I will mention is if for any reason you were looking to drive both a TT2 and a Qutest, the driver is identical for both. And what that means is that when I was trying to do some A/B comparisons, I couldn't run both DACs off the same computer because Windows didn't know where to send the signal. It was confused which one was which because they're using the same driver. So it's just a really small detail, very unlikely that you're going to be doing that with your system, but I thought I'd mention it just in case. So let's talk now about the sound from the TT2. Because this is an all-in-one, the only way I can really talk about the sound is to split it into the DAC and the amp stages separately. So I'm going to start with the DAC. To test the DAC from the TT2, what I did was put it up against the Qutest. So I was using the outputs from the TT2 and the outputs from the Qutest, both to external amplifiers. I used the variable mode from the TT2 to match the output level so that it was comparable in volume to the Qutest for all testing. And what I found as I listened to both was that the TT2 is more resolving, provides more detail, and creates a greater sense of space in the soundstage compared to the Qutest, which is sitting just off camera over there in case you wonder why I keep pointing in that direction. As part of that larger soundstage, there's also a sense of a little bit more distance between the listener and the main vocalist, main instrumentalist. So everything's just a bit more spacious, a bit more separated, and a little bit more cleanly resolved. For some of this testing, I used a couple of the tracks that have been suggested by viewers. So I want to talk you briefly through what I was hearing, just to illustrate the differences between the Qutest and the TT2 as a point of reference. The first track I tried was Goodbye Yellow Brick Road by Sarah Bareilles, and that was suggested by Lan Yi O. What I noticed when listening to that was that the TT2 produced a greater sense of harmonic richness in the piano. Both sounded fantastic, but the piano is an incredible instrument for testing because so much is going on in each strike of a note in a piano. There's the percussive hit of the hammer, and then the string vibrating creates all kinds of harmonics within the string, but also all kinds of harmonics for all the other strings and the cabinet of the piano itself and the sounding board that the strings are sitting on. There's just so much going on. What became really evident with the TT2 was it was better able to recreate all of that complexity with all of the piano notes. The Qutest is still fantastic, the TT2 just takes it to another level. The other thing I found in that recording was that Sarah Bareilles' voice was just a little bit better separated from the piano, whereas in the case of the Qutest, the two of them merged a little bit together in the sense that they sounded like they were kind of coming from exactly the same space, whereas the TT2 just had them next to each other, completely adjacent, but not quite on top of one another. So it was subtle, but it was definitely better from the TT2. And I'll talk in a moment about why that is, but before I do, I want to mention the other track that I tried was You Don't Know What Love Is by Melody Gardot, and that one was suggested by JS. Now what I heard in that one was that from the TT2, the texture in Melody's voice was just a little bit better defined. So breathiness, vocal textures and timbre was just a little bit more resolved in the TT2 than the Qutest. Again, both are excellent, but the TT2 has the edge. The sense of space again was better in the TT2, and the real clincher for me was there's a trumpet in the left of the soundstage, which from the TT2 was absolutely holographic, like I could reach out and touch where it was. Whereas in the case of the Qutest, it was left, it was clearly defined, but it didn't have that holographic presence that I got from the TT2. So overall, I'd say the TT2 is everything that the Qutest does well, but done even better again. And that's because the TT2 uses twice the number of taps compared to the Qutest. So the Qutest uses about 50,000 taps, just under 50,000. The TT2 uses just under 100,000 taps. For those not familiar with Chord's products, when I'm talking about taps, What I'm referring to is the number of times the DAC will revisit the digital samples to recreate the analog signal. Shannon's sampling theory, which is the basis for a lot of the mathematics going on inside Chord's DACs, says that you need an infinite number of taps to reproduce an analog signal perfectly from a set of digital samples. Now, we're never going to get to an infinite number of taps because it would take an infinite amount of time to process the signal. But what it tells us is that the more taps you get, the closer you're getting to a perfect recreation of that analog signal. And that's what's going on when I go from the Qutest to the TT2 and hear the sorts of fine details and spatial cues that the TT2 can produce better than the Qutest. The TT2 with those extra taps is recreating the full analog signal with more clarity and more resolution than the Qutest can do. Now, I'll talk a bit more about this concept in the M-scaler review. That's the final part of this series. So if you do want to know more about that, make sure you subscribe and stay tuned. That one's coming in a couple of weeks from now. But for now, what we need to know is that the TT2 is producing a better sense of clarity, a better sense of resolution, a better sense of space, and sharper, cleaner imaging overall. It's not night and day difference, but it's significant enough that the upgrade from the Qutest to the TT2 is noticeable and definitely worthwhile. Before I move on to talk about the amp stage, I just want to say thanks to all the viewers that suggested tracks for me to use in my testing. If I haven't referred to yours in this review, it's not because I've forgotten about you, I just didn't want to dump every single suggestion all at once. So do stay tuned, make sure you subscribe if you want to hear when I use your track suggestions. And if you haven't suggested any tracks yet and you've got a favorite that you'd like me to try out, do mention it down in the comments below. Moving on to the amp stage now, the challenge with a product like this is that the amp is integrated in with the DAC and there's no analog inputs. So the only way I could really compare the amplifier in the Hugo TT2 was to compare the outputs from the headphone sockets on the TT2 with some other headphone amplifiers that I've got here. I started off with the Auralic Taurus Mark II, which is a fantastic amplifier, not made anymore, so it's only available on the second-hand market, but is an outstanding and amazing piece of value for money. Sadly, I had to sell the Taurus to fund the purchase of the TT2, so I didn't have it handy for thorough and extensive testing, but I did a brief test before I did ship it off. What I'd say is that the TT2 is ever so slightly more resolving than the Taurus, but realistically, I think they're comparable rather than one being better or worse. And that's because the Taurus has a tonality that the TT2 doesn't quite match. And that is that it's just got the tiniest hint of warmth, and it's so tiny a hint that it doesn't color the sound or make it thick or muddy, but it just presents a really engaging and beautiful to listen to sound. The TT2, on the other hand, is so transparent that I can understand some people potentially finding it analytical or cold depending on what they're connecting it to. That's not my personal opinion of it, but I can understand why some people may feel that way. So the Taurus stacked up really well, and if I didn't have to sell it, I would have kept it as a nice complement to the TT2's razor sharp precision. Moving on then to a couple of amps that I do have here for extended testing. The first one I tried was the Topping A90. I connected that up using the AudioQuest Yukon XLR interconnects, so we had balanced output from the Hugo TT2 all the way through into the balanced A90. And what I found was that again, the TT2 just had the edge in terms of resolution and detail and also soundstage space once again. The A90 is an excellent amplifier, as I'll talk about in my review of it, but the TT2 just has the edge. Now, I can only put that down to the fact that the TT2 output stage is kept deliberately really simple in order to create maximum transparency. One philosophy that I've sometimes heard is that a digital circuit should be as complex as possible to recreate the analog signal, whereas an output or an analog stage should be as simple as possible in order to not mess with the analog signal at all. From that point of view, the TT2 is about as simple as it can get in providing as clean a connection straight from the DAC and into your headphones or speakers. On top of that, the TT2 is designed using super capacitors, as I mentioned before. The important thing to know is that capacitors are different from batteries in the sense that a capacitor is designed to rapidly charge and release energy. What that means from a musical point of view is that using capacitors as your source of power for the music means you've got readily available, super fast response power on tap to respond to the demands of the music. So rapid dynamic swings in the music can be responded to immediately with super clean power. All of that to me combines to make the TT2 incredibly clean, incredibly resolving, and incredibly fast. Up against it, something like the A90 just sounds a little bit congested, and I mean a little bit congested, because the sound is more of a single blob of music, whereas the TT2 separates it out more so, both in 2 dimensions but also in 3 dimensions. So the A90 is fantastic, the TT2 is just better. To provide a good example of that, I listened to Nude by Radiohead as suggested by John Ellison, and the sound that I heard was the TT2 provided individual sounds throughout the entire soundstage, and Radiohead recordings tend to be really exacting, so if you do get a good system, you can really hear every single sound. The TT2 did that beautifully. It rendered each individual sound, and particularly there's a hi-hat just left of center that was a little bit holographic once again in similar ways to that trumpet in Melody Gardot's track. So the TT2 produces this kind of accuracy and holographic image placement within the soundstage. The A90 was a little bit more congested. It pulled everything together a bit more and just didn't provide that sense of space and holographic resolution that the TT2 is capable of. I don't want to suggest that the A90 is not a fantastic amp, and I do look forward to sharing the review here. It's just that the TT2 is outstanding. They're also at very different price points, so that should be taken into account as well. The final amplifier that I tried was my trusty Bottlehead Mainline over behind me here. Because the Mainline is a single-ended input amplifier, I was running RCA outs of the TT2 using a set of Tara Labs RCA interconnects. What I heard out of that was that the Mainline probably had 98 to 99% of the resolution of the TT2, but once again the TT2 wins out for absolute transparency and clarity. What the Mainline did do a little bit better was it produces a sense of mid-range warmth and weight that's only subtle, so it's not a thick, lush, tubey amplifier, but it produces a little bit of extra mid-range weight that just made the sound a little bit more engaging in some cases. As I mentioned before, some may find the TT2's cleanliness being a little bit too much depending on what your headphones, your speakers or your amplifiers are doing with the sound. So in some cases people may look to an external amplifier, but rest assured that if you're looking for absolute transparency, the TT2's internal amplifier is probably the way to go. This is not a case where an all-in-one is sacrificing the quality of one component in order to make a convenient all-in-one package. What you're getting here is an amazing DAC with an amplifier that's been optimized to keep the signal chain as simple as possible to produce absolute transparency through the outputs. So summing everything up, what we've got here is a true endgame flagship level product. There's no doubt in my mind that the TT2 as both a DAC and an amp is providing some of the best sound you are ever going to get from a single device like this. I'm not here saying it's the best DAC in the world. I'm also not saying it's the best amplifier in the world. What I am saying is that it's the combination that makes it a really amazing product. To have something this small and simple be everything you need for your perfect end-game listening setup, particularly with headphones, is really outstanding. For me, it's a shame that there's a few ergonomic niggles with this, like the LCD display angle and the 15-second delay when switching modes. There's a few little things like that that I don't particularly like. Oh, and that annoying 3.5mm headphone socket. There's a few things like that that are a bit frustrating, but other than that, this is just an absolutely stellar piece of equipment. And without giving too much away, when you add the M scaler to it, it's just a whole nother ballgame again. So if you're interested in knowing more about that, make sure to stay tuned, hit the subscribe button. The M scaler review is coming soon. For now though, I'd say that if you're in the market for an endgame type DAC and headphone amp, you should absolutely consider the TT2. If you're not needing the headphone amp, do take a look at my review of the Chord Qutest and the M scaler, because that may be a better option for some people that don't need the amplification functions. And in some ways, having now spent more time with the TT2, the ergonomics and the interface of the Qutest and the M scaler may be preferable to some people, because that is probably the drawback for me of the TT2. That said, I'm going to very happily keep it in my system for now. For reference, I did purchase this unit with my own money. It's not been given to me for review. I am going to absolutely keep this and love every single second of listening to it because it's just that good. For now though, let's wrap things up. I hope you're all staying safe and well out there. Happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.